1940. An anxious silence hung over the English Channel. Dunkirk, a small port city on the northern coast of France, did not yet know that its name would soon enter history as a symbol of both catastrophe and miraculous salvation. The strategic importance of this port is hard to overstate. The last window to England for retreating Allied forces, trapped between the sea and the rapidly advancing Wehrmacht. Hitler's lightning campaign brought Belgium and the Netherlands to their knees, and now threatened France. The British Expeditionary Force and French divisions found themselves in a deadly trap. Their only hope became this seaside city with its harbor and sandy beaches. Clouds gathered over Dunkirk, literally and metaphorically. The roar of German planes grew louder, and the front line inexorably approached the city. At that time, no one imagined the scale of the upcoming operation and how it would change the course of the war. Dunkirk froze, awaiting its hour in history. Dunkirk is not just a point on the map. It is a key to the English Channel, located at the junction of France, Belgium, and the sea route to Great Britain. In May 1940, this port city became the epicenter of dramatic events of global scale. Its unique geographical position determined its fate at the beginning of the war. On one side, the open sea and a path to salvation. On the other, advancing German divisions. Nature seemed to have created here a natural trap, and at the same time, the last chance for retreating Allied troops. Dunkirk's deep water harbor allowed large warships to dock, while its extensive sandy beaches, stretching for over 10 kilometers, could serve as improvised piers for evacuation. But these same features made the city vulnerable. The low-lying terrain, surrounded by dunes and swamps, made it difficult to establish reliable defensive positions. The system of canals, originally built to drain coastal areas, now limited the maneuverability of troops. For the German command, the capture of Dunkirk would mean the complete annihilation of a significant part of British and French forces. This would open a direct path to the subjugation of Great Britain, the last bastion of resistance in Western Europe. For the Allies, holding this port for at least a few days became a matter of survival for entire armies. Every hour of delay could cost tens of thousands of lives. The strategic importance of Dunkirk was amplified by its industrial infrastructure. Oil depots, ship repair workshops, railway junctions, all of this represented immense value for the warring parties. The capture of such a base intact would give the Germans a powerful springboard for further operations. That is why the Allied command was ready to sacrifice the city, but save the people. German bombers methodically turned Dunkirk into ruins, wiping out port facilities and residential areas. Pillars of black smoke from burning oil depots were visible even from the English shore. In clear weather, residents of Dover could see them. This ominous symbol of impending disaster forced the British government to act decisively and unconventionally. Few understood then that the unfolding drama would become a turning point in the war. Meanwhile, German tank columns inexorably tightened the encirclement. Time was working against the city's defenders. Every minute of delay reduced the chances of salvation. Dunkirk was turning into a cauldron where the fire of artillery and aviation mixed with the sea breeze, creating a hellish atmosphere between two elements, water and flame. May 10, 1940. The gray sky over the Ardennes was rent by the roar of engines. The German war machine had begun to move. Operation Gelb began with a lightning strike against neutral Netherlands and Belgium. The world first encountered what would later be called the Blitzkrieg, a lightning war. The Wehrmacht employed tactics that revolutionized the understanding of modern warfare. Tank wedges, supported from the air by Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, broke through the Allied defenses on narrow sections of the front. Motorized infantry followed the steel spearhead, consolidating success and widening the breaches. The French command was paralyzed by the speed of the German offensive. While generals studied maps in headquarters, Guderian's and Rommel's tanks had already advanced dozens of kilometers deep into enemy territory. The Maginot Line, the pride of French defensive strategy, remained far from the main thrust. The Germans simply bypassed it through the seemingly impassable Ardennes forests. On May 17th, advanced units of the Wehrmacht reached the Oise River. On the 20th day of the operation, German tanks reached the coast near Abbeville, cutting off the northern Allied grouping from the main French forces. The British Expeditionary Force, the Belgian Army, and the best French divisions found themselves in a gigantic cauldron. The only escape route for them remained a narrow corridor to the sea, to Dunkirk. The success of the Blitzkrieg was due not only to tactical innovations. German troops had superiority in organization and command. Each tank corps was equipped with radio stations, allowing real-time coordination of actions. Commanders were in the front lines of the advancing forces, making decisions on the spot, rather than waiting for orders from distant headquarters. The Allies, on the other hand, relied on telephone communication and couriers, which in the rapidly changing situation proved to be a fatal flaw. On May 26th, advanced units of the Wehrmacht approached the outskirts of Dunkirk. More than 400,000 Allied soldiers were trapped. They were pressed against the sea, deprived of supplies, heavy weapons, and transport. It seemed that disaster was inevitable. No one could have predicted that at this critical moment something inexplicable would happen. The advance of German tanks would suddenly stop. The steel columns, which just yesterday had been irresistibly rushing forward, froze a few kilometers from their goal. This decision would become one of the most mysterious pages of the war, and would give the Allies that precious chance they had no right to miss. On May 24, 1940, something occurred that historians still call one of the most enigmatic decisions of the Second World War. The Wehrmacht's tank divisions, located just 24 kilometers from Dunkirk, suddenly received an order to halt. Colonel General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, relayed the directive. The steel fist, which could have definitively crushed the encircled Allied forces, froze in place. Tank crews looked bewildered at the road leading to the sea. What happened? Why, at the moment of decisive victory, was an order given to suspend the offensive? This question has spawned numerous theories and debates, which continue to this day. The official version of the German command stated that the tanks needed maintenance. After the rapid dash through France, the vehicles indeed required repairs, and spare parts were not keeping up with the advancing units. However, this reason appears unconvincing. Even accounting for losses and breakdowns, the Germans had enough combat-ready tanks to complete the operation. A more plausible version seems to be Hitler's personal intervention. The Führer feared that the tanks would get bogged down in the marshy terrain around Dunkirk. Aerial photography showed flooded lowlands and canals, which could pose a serious obstacle for armored vehicles. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, seized the moment to propose an alternative: to complete the rout of the Allies with air power. He convinced Hitler that dive bombers were capable of destroying enemy troops on the beaches and sinking ships at sea. For Göring, this was a chance to prove the superiority of air forces and strengthen his position in the Nazi hierarchy. There is also a third, more pragmatic version. Hitler, perhaps, intentionally allowed British troops to evacuate, hoping for a peace agreement with Great Britain. In his inner circle, the Führer repeatedly expressed respect for the British Empire and did not seek its destruction. He hoped that, having lost their weaponry but preserved their army, the British would be more inclined to negotiate. Proponents of this theory point to subsequent peace proposals made by Germany in the summer of 1940. Whatever the true reason, the consequences of this decision were colossal. The precious 3 days granted to the Allies allowed for the organization of an evacuation that went down in history as the Miracle of Dunkirk. British command gained time to prepare Operation Dynamo, a rescue mission unprecedented in scale. If German tanks had continued their advance, the entire northern group of Allied forces would have been destroyed or captured. Britain would have lost the core of its ground forces, and the moral blow could have led to capitulation. Instead, hundreds of thousands of soldiers returned home to later become the nucleus of the army that would land in Normandy 4 years later. Hitler's gesture of mercy, if it truly was one, ultimately turned against Germany. The tank generals never forgave the Führer for this decision. Heinz Guderian, in his memoirs, called the halt at Dunkirk the first serious miscalculation of the German command. Erich von Manstein believed that it was then that the opportunity for a swift end to the war in the West was missed. On May 26, 1940, Admiral Bertram Ramsay was summoned to the Admiralty. In an underground bunker beneath Dover Castle, he was given what seemed like an impossible task: to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. Initial calculations were modest: to save at least 45,000 men in 2 days. No one imagined the true scale of the upcoming operation. The codename Dynamo reflected the hope for an energetic and swift execution of the task. But how to evacuate tens of thousands of soldiers from a narrow strip of beach under continuous bombardment? Dunkirk's port facilities had already been destroyed by the Luftwaffe. Large ships could not approach the shore. The shallow waters required the use of shallow draft vessels. And then a solution was born that could have been considered insane if it hadn't worked: to mobilize the civilian fleet. Everything that could stay afloat and cross the English Channel was requisitioned: fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, river barges, passenger ferries, and even lifeboats. Operation Dynamo began on the night of May 27th. The first evacuated soldiers, just over 7,000 men, were brought to Dover on Royal Navy destroyers. But even then it became clear that the pace of evacuation needed to be increased. Every hour of delay increased the risk of complete annihilation of the surrounded troops. Logistical problems snowballed. Thousands of exhausted soldiers accumulated on the beaches of Dunkirk. Organizing their boarding onto ships under constant air raids was extremely difficult. Improvised piers had to be built from trucks sunk near the shore. Soldiers stood waist-deep in cold water for hours, waiting for their turn. Discipline was maintained only thanks to British composure and the clear work of the officers. The evacuation continued around the clock. By day, under continuous air attacks; by night, in complete darkness, without navigational lights, with the risk of collisions and running aground. Each crossing of the strait was an act of heroism. Many vessels made several trips despite damage and crew fatigue. The coordination of hundreds of diverse vessels, many of which were operated by civilians without military experience, presented particular difficulty. Radio communication was often disrupted, and the use of light signals could attract the attention of German aircraft. They had to rely on the simplest communication methods and the personal initiative of the captains. By May 29th, it became clear that the original evacuation plan needed to be revised. Instead of 2 days, the operation stretched indefinitely. Instead of 45,000 people, many times more had to be saved. Churchill, who had just become Prime Minister, personally monitored the progress of the operation. For Britain, this was a matter not only of military but also of moral survival. At dawn on May 28, 1940, the coast of England witnessed an unusual spectacle. Hundreds of small vessels, fishing boats, pleasure craft, yachts, and barges pushed off from the shore and headed towards the smoking horizon of Dunkirk. This was not a military armada, but a flotilla of civilian vessels responding to their country's desperate call. When it became clear that large warships could not approach the shallow waters of the Dunkirk beaches, Admiral Ramsay made an unprecedented decision. Telephone calls and telegrams went out across the entire southern coast of England, requesting any available craft for the rescue operation. Charles Lightoller, former first officer of the Titanic, did not hesitate for a minute. At 66, he personally steered his yacht Sundowner across the strait. Fisherman Tom Brown from Ramsgate, upon hearing the call, simply said, "If our lads are there, we must get them out," and set sail in his old trawler. Small boats, usually used for Sunday outings or fishing, now sailed through the smoke of burning oil depots, under the whistle of falling bombs and the roar of anti-aircraft guns. Their captains, ordinary civilians, many of whom had never been to war, displayed miracles of bravery and seamanship. John Atkinson, owner of a pleasure boat from Brighton, made 5 trips to the French coast in 3 days. His vessel, designed for 12 passengers, returned each time overloaded with more than 50 soldiers. "We just couldn't leave them there," he recalled later. "You should have seen their eyes when they realized they were saved." In the shallows, small boats picked up soldiers directly from the water and delivered them to warships anchored in deeper waters. Some boats shuttled between the shore and the destroyers, not returning to England for several days. Their crews worked to complete exhaustion, often under fire from German aircraft. William Pearson, skipper of the fishing vessel Temessus, recalled, "The sea was burning from spilled fuel. There were debris and bodies everywhere, but we saw living people clinging to anything that floated, and we just couldn't leave." Particularly tragic was the case of the passenger ferry Mona's Queen, which took on board over 2,000 soldiers but was sunk by German bombers. Despite this, dozens of small boats rushed to help, rescuing people from the icy water. By June 4th, when Operation Dynamo concluded, the small boats had brought home about 100,000 people, almost a third of all those evacuated. Their feat became a symbol of national unity in the face of the greatest threat. Churchill, in his famous speech, called it a miracle of deliverance, wrought by valor, by perseverance, by an unfaltering fidelity. May 28, 1940. The sky over Dunkirk darkened, with hundreds of aircraft bearing black crosses on their wings. The Luftwaffe began a massive air operation against the concentration of Allied troops and evacuation ships. Hermann Göring, confident in the strength of his air squadrons, personally promised Hitler, "My planes will destroy them on the beaches. Not one will escape by sea." Heinkel 111 and Junkers 87 bombers, wave after wave, unleashed their deadly payload on the coastline and port waters. Diving Stukas with their sirens blaring terrified the soldiers gathered on the sandy beaches. Their wail became the auditory symbol of this tragedy. British soldiers called these attacks the Devil's Visit. But the German Air Force unexpectedly encountered fierce resistance. The Royal Air Force threw all available fighters into battle. Squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes took off from airfields in southern England and patrolled the airspace over the strait. The pilots made 5 or 6 sorties a day, returning to base only for refueling and rearming. The air battles over Dunkirk were particularly fierce. British pilots understood that the fate of thousands of their countrymen depended on their actions. German pilots, who had previously encountered little serious resistance, were surprised by the enemy's aggressiveness and skill. Spitfire pilot Alan Deere shot down 5 in one day, defending the evacuation corridor. His plane was riddled with bullets, but he continued to fight until his last round. The Luftwaffe's tactics were simple and effective. Messerschmitt 109 fighters cleared the sky, and the bombers following them attacked defenseless ships and troop concentrations. Small vessels, lacking anti-aircraft armament, were particularly vulnerable. Dozens of civilian boats and cutters were sunk by direct hits or machine gun fire. But the Germans did not account for one factor: the weather. Low cloud cover and fog often hid the beaches from air raids, providing a respite for the evacuation. On clear days, the British used smoke screens created by special vessels. Black clouds of smoke rose above the water, concealing the movement of ships. The Admiralty also developed an air defense system for the evacuation fleet. Destroyers and specially equipped trawlers with anti-aircraft guns lined up along the route, forming a protective corridor. Their fire forced German pilots to drop bombs from a greater height, reducing the accuracy of their strikes. Despite all efforts, losses were enormous. The Luftwaffe sank 6 destroyers and 240 small vessels. Thousands of soldiers died on the beaches from bombs and machine gun fire. But the main goal, the complete destruction of the evacuation fleet, was not achieved by the German Air Force. Göring overestimated the capabilities of his squadrons and underestimated the determination of the British. The Royal Air Force, despite the enemy's numerical superiority, managed to create an air shield over Dunkirk. This battle became a prelude to the future Battle of Britain and proved that the Luftwaffe was not all-powerful. The first rays of dawn on June 4, 1940, illuminated the deserted beaches of Dunkirk. Operation Dynamo was nearing its end, but for thousands of French soldiers, evacuation did not mean salvation. They remained to cover the British retreat, knowing that their chances of escape were practically nil. These men in faded blue uniforms became the last line of defense between the advancing Wehrmacht and the sea, the last hope for those still awaiting boarding ships. General Jean-Marie Joseph Mouchot, commander of the French rearguard units, gathered his officers in the ruined building of the port administration. "Gentlemen," he said, surveying their tired faces, "our duty is to buy time for our allies. Every hour the Germans are delayed means thousands of lives saved." No one uttered a word. Everyone understood that this was, most likely, the last order of their lives. The French positions formed a semicircle around the city. The 45th Infantry Division and the remnants of the 12th Motorized Division took up defensive positions in the suburbs, entrenching themselves in semi-destroyed buildings. They had little artillery left and almost no anti-tank guns. Ammunition was conserved, understanding that there would be no resupply. Captain Pierre Dubois, commander of a company in the 110th Infantry Regiment, wrote in his diary, "My men are tired, but determined. They know there is nowhere to retreat. Behind us is the sea, and on it, our allies. We will give them time." The Germans launched a decisive assault on June 3rd. Tanks of the Wehrmacht's 19th Panzer Division broke through defenses on the western sector. The French responded with fierce fire. Sergeant Jacques Lefebvre and his anti-tank crew knocked out 3 German tanks before his position was destroyed by a direct hit. Fighting raged for every house, for every street. By the evening of June 3rd, the Germans controlled 2/3 of the city. The remaining French units concentrated in the port and on the beaches. continuing to cover the last hours of the evacuation. On the morning of June 4th, the British command offered General Mouchot to evacuate the remaining defenders. But it was too late. German units had cut off the road to the sea. The last ship, the destroyer Shikari, took on board about 800 French soldiers and sailed away under German artillery fire. The rest, over 40,000, were captured. Some French officers chose suicide over surrender. Lieutenant Henri Bertrand, whose company held the approaches to the eastern mole, shot himself when he saw approaching German tanks. His last words were, "For France, long live the Republic." The fate of the defenders of Dunkirk varied. Most ended up in German prisoner-of-war camps, where they spent long years. Some managed to escape and join the resistance. A few were able to reach England in fishing boats. Their sacrifice was not in vain. Thanks to the resilience of the French rearguard units, the British managed to evacuate over 300,000 people, the core of the army that would return to the continent 4 years later. Churchill, in his speech to the House of Commons, paid tribute to this feat. We must never forget that our salvation was made possible by the valor and self-sacrifice of the French soldiers. Operation Dynamo ended on June 4, 1940. In 9 days, 338,226 people were evacuated from Dunkirk, a number that exceeded the wildest expectations. But the cost of this rescue was enormous. Thousands of dead were left on the beaches and in the waters of the English Channel. 6 British and 3 French destroyers were sunk. 240 small vessels never returned to their home ports. The Luftwaffe conducted over 1,300 sorties over Dunkirk, dropping hundreds of tons of bombs. The Royal Air Force lost 168 aircraft defending the evacuation corridor. Human losses were difficult to count. About 6,000 British soldiers died during the evacuation. French losses were even higher, at least 30,000 killed and wounded. Over 40,000 French soldiers were taken prisoner, left to cover the Allied retreat. But the civilian population of Dunkirk suffered the heaviest losses. The city was practically wiped off the face of the earth. 80% of the buildings were reduced to ruins. The port, industrial enterprises, residential areas, everything was destroyed by bombing. Tens of thousands of civilians became refugees, losing all their property. Many died under bombs or were killed in street fighting. The material losses of the British Army were also catastrophic. Almost all the heavy equipment and weaponry of the expeditionary force remained on the continent. 880 artillery pieces, 7,000 tons of ammunition, 90,000 rifles, 7,200 tons of fuel, and 120,000 vehicles. Evacuated soldiers returned home literally with what they had on. Many arrived in England without shoes, having lost their boots in the muddy sand of Dunkirk's beaches. Winston Churchill, in his famous speech to the House of Commons, did not hide the scale of the losses. Wars are not won by evacuations, but in this deliverance there is a victory. Britain lost equipment, but saved people. Experienced soldiers who would become the backbone of a new army. Dunkirk became a turning point in the war. If the evacuation had failed, Great Britain could have been left without ground forces capable of resisting the Wehrmacht. The loss of 300,000 trained soldiers would have been a blow from which it would have been difficult to recover. Instead, Operation Dynamo turned a military defeat into a moral victory. The spirit of Dunkirk, resilience in the face of disaster, the ability to unite in a critical moment, became a national symbol. For the German command, the results of the Dunkirk operation were contradictory. On the one hand, they captured a huge amount of military equipment and weaponry. On the other hand, they missed the opportunity to destroy the main forces of the enemy. Hitler admitted in private conversations that stopping the tanks was a mistake. But in public speeches, he presented Dunkirk as a great victory, proof of the Wehrmacht's invincibility. For the French, Dunkirk became a symbol of both heroism and the bitterness of betrayal. Many French soldiers felt abandoned by their allies, left to cover their retreat. This wound in relations between France and Great Britain took a long time to heal. When speaking of the Dunkirk operation, one often forgets those who did not wear military uniforms, the ordinary residents of the city and its surroundings. For them, the war began not with orders and strategic maps, but with the wail of sirens and the roar of the first bombs that fell on peaceful neighborhoods. Marcel Dupont, a baker from the old part of Dunkirk, recalled, "On May 10th, we still thought the war would pass us by. On the 12th, I was already trying to save my family from our burning house." For the 42,000 residents of Dunkirk, May 1940 became a month that divided life into before and after. The first bombardments caught the city off guard. The Luftwaffe methodically destroyed not only port facilities and military targets, but also residential areas, hospitals, schools, churches. Nothing was spared. The Dunkirk City Hall attempted to organize the evacuation of the civilian population, but there was a catastrophic shortage of transport. Most vehicles had been requisitioned by the army, and the roads to the south were choked with retreating troops. Thousands of citizens were forced to leave the city on foot, carrying children in their arms and pushing carts with meager belongings. Elise Martin, a schoolteacher, organized the evacuation of an entire class of children. We walked for 3 days, hiding in ditches every time German planes appeared. Some children were only 7 years old. They held hands and didn't cry, even when bombs exploded nearby. Those who could not leave found themselves in the epicenter of a military hell. Many took shelter in basements and makeshift bomb shelters. Henri Lefort, the city archivist, spent 9 days in the basement of the town hall, chronicling the city's destruction. On May 29th, the ground trembled continuously. It seemed as if the entire city was collapsing over our heads. The fate of the wounded in the city hospital was particularly tragic. When the building was damaged by a direct hit, medical staff heroically evacuated patients to the basements of neighboring buildings. Nurse Jeanne Dubois did not leave her post, even when she was informed that her house had been destroyed. "My patients could not walk. I could not abandon them." By early June, when the last British soldiers were leaving the beaches, Dunkirk lay in ruins. More than 70% of the buildings were completely destroyed, the rest severely damaged. The once prosperous port had been transformed into an apocalyptic landscape of rubble and ashes. For those residents who remained or returned after the evacuation, 4 long years of Nazi occupation began. The German authorities established a harsh regime. Curfew, rationing, forced labor became daily life. Many Dunkirkers were sent to work in Germany. Laurent Picard's family was separated. He himself ended up in a factory in Essen. His wife remained with 3 children in a semi-destroyed house on the outskirts of Dunkirk. "Every day was a struggle for survival," she later recalled. "We bartered things for food with farmers, gathered roots, fished, despite the prohibitions." When the last evacuation ships left the smoking shores of Dunkirk, no one could have predicted that a military defeat would soon transform into one of the most powerful symbols of the British national spirit. Operation Dynamo had ended, but a new battle was beginning for the hearts and minds of the British people, for their faith in ultimate victory over Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill, having just assumed the post of Prime Minister, understood. The country faced the greatest threat in its history. It was necessary to transform the evacuation from Dunkirk from a symbol of defeat into a symbol of the nation's unyielding will. On June 4, 1940, he delivered a speech in the House of Commons that became a turning point in the psychological war. The British propaganda machine acted swiftly and effectively. Just one day after the evacuation ended, the newspaper came out with the headline, "The term was instantly picked up by other publications." Newsreels showed returning soldiers not as defeated, but as heroes, saved thanks to national unity and comradeship. The phrase itself first appeared in an editorial on June 7th. It defined a special state of the nation, the ability to remain steadfast in the most difficult circumstances, to find strength where it seemed impossible, and to turn defeat into a springboard for future victory. For ordinary Britons, the story of the flotilla of small boats that saved soldiers became a powerful unifying symbol. Stories of how owners of pleasure yachts, fishing trawlers, and other small vessels voluntarily crossed the channel under Luftwaffe bombs to rescue their compatriots evoked a deep emotional response. This was no longer just a military operation, it was a national epic. The Ministry of Information skillfully used these sentiments. Throughout the country, exhibitions of Dunkirk photographs were held, and meetings with participants in the evacuation were organized. Posters depicting small boats going to the aid of the army appeared in every town. The slogan, quote, became the unofficial motto of the country. But the quote was not merely a propaganda construct. It genuinely changed the psychological state of the nation. Sociological surveys conducted in June 1940 showed a sharp increase in British confidence in ultimate victory, from 37 to 64%. The writer Vera Brittain noted in her diary, quote, This transformation of public consciousness had practical consequences. Volunteer enlistment in the local defense guard tripled. Sales of war bonds reached record levels. Strikes at defense enterprises practically ceased. The church also played an important role in shaping the quote. 8. The Archbishop of Canterbury called the Army's salvation divine intervention and declared Sunday, June 9th, a day of national thanksgiving prayer. Churches across the country were packed. For the German High Command, the Dunkirk operation was simultaneously a triumph and a missed opportunity, which later proved fatal. When the dust settled over the ruins of Dunkirk in early June 1940, and the last British ships disappeared beyond the horizon, an analysis of what had happened began at the Führer's headquarters, which caused serious disagreements among the highest ranks of the Wehrmacht. Hitler publicly declared Dunkirk a great victory. In his speech to the Reichstag on July 19th, he proudly listed the trophies. However, behind the closed doors of the military headquarters, the mood was different. Colonel General Franz Halder, Chief of the General Staff of the Army, noted in his diary, "The decision to halt the tank divisions on May 24th was subjected to particularly sharp criticism." Heinz Guderian, who commanded the tank corps, later wrote in his memoirs, quote, 2. Erich von Manstein was even more categorical. Quote, 3. Nevertheless, in German society, the Dunkirk operation was perceived exclusively as a victory. Goebbels' propaganda filled newspapers and radio broadcasts with reports of the panicked flight of the English and the rout of elite British divisions. Newsreels showed mountains of abandoned weapons and columns of French prisoners. The fact that the main part of the British Army had successfully evacuated was kept silent. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, was one of the few who publicly expressed concern. "We allowed the English to preserve their army. Now we will have to fight them on their island, which significantly complicates our task. Colonel Adolf Galland, a Luftwaffe ace, admitted after the war, "Over Dunkirk, for the first time, we felt that the Royal Air Force was a serious adversary. Their pilots fought with desperate bravery, defending the evacuation. This was the first warning before the Battle of Britain." For Hitler, Dunkirk became the moment when his belief in his own military genius solidified, despite the missed opportunity. The success of the Blitzkrieg in France overshadowed the strategic miscalculation off the coast. This led to a dangerous overconfidence, which would later manifest itself in even more catastrophic decisions on the Eastern Front. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments of the Third Reich, recalled a conversation with the Führer in June 1940. Hitler was convinced that he had shown mercy to England by allowing its army to evacuate. He sincerely believed that the British would appreciate this gesture and enter into peace talks. This illusion cost Germany dearly. Instead of capitulating, Great Britain used the miracle of Dunkirk as a powerful mobilizing symbol. The rescued army became the core of the forces that would land in Normandy 4 years later. Dunkirk, a mirror of a divided Europe. The history of this seaside city does not belong exclusively to Britain and France. For different peoples, the events of May-June 1940 became a symbol with completely different meanings. It is especially interesting how the evacuation was perceived by countries not directly involved in the operation, but whose fate was forever changed by its consequences. For the Poles, the first victims of Nazi aggression, Dunkirk became a bitter reminder of the fragility of Allied obligations. The Polish government in exile, established in London, watched the evacuation with alarm. General Władysław Sikorski, Prime Minister of the Polish government, wrote in his memoirs, "Observing the evacuation of the British from Dunkirk, I could not help but recall September 39, when Poland waited in vain for promised aid." In Polish historical memory, Dunkirk remained a symbol of Western pragmatism, a willingness to sacrifice allies for one's own salvation. However, many Poles fought on the beaches of Dunkirk as part of Polish formations of the French army. Their heroism became part of the national narrative of an unceasing struggle for freedom. For the Soviet Union, which had not yet entered the war, the events off the coast of the English Channel had a dual meaning. Official propaganda, tied to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, presented Dunkirk as proof of the weakness of the, quote, one. The newspaper, quote, two, wrote about the, quote, three, remaining silent about the scale and complexity of the evacuation. However, in military circles, the operation was studied with professional interest. Marshal Boris Shaposhnikov, chief of the General Staff of the Red Army, ordered a detailed analysis of the actions of both sides. Later, after Germany's attack on the USSR, the Soviet assessment of Dunkirk changed. In the works of military historians, the evacuation became an example of resilience and organization in a critical situation. For Russians, Dunkirk acquired special significance after the war, becoming a symbol of missed opportunities for opening a second front. If the Allies had landed in France not in '44, but immediately after Dunkirk, millions of Soviet lives would have been saved. This thought became part of the national memory of the war. The Italians, who entered the war on June 10th, just 6 days after the completion of the evacuation, perceived Dunkirk as proof of the invincibility of their German ally. Mussolini, fearing to miss out on a share in the division of France, hastened to declare war on an already defeated enemy. This decision, made under the impression of German successes, including Dunkirk, subsequently led Italy to catastrophe. In post-war Italian historiography, Dunkirk became a symbol of fascist adventurism and blind adherence to Hitler. For Americans, who still maintained neutrality, the drama of Dunkirk became a turning point in public opinion. Reports by American journalists, such as Edward Murrow, who broadcast dramatic reports from London about the evacuation, for the first time made many Americans emotionally involved in the European conflict. President Roosevelt, speaking to graduates of the University of Virginia on June 11th, directly linked America's security to the fate of Great Britain after Dunkirk. For many peoples of Eastern Europe, Czechs, Slovaks, Yugoslavs, Dunkirk became a harbinger of their own fate. If even powerful France and Britain could not stop the Nazi war machine, what chances did small countries have? This thought pushed some to resistance, others to collaboration. The Dunkirk operation was not just a military event, it deeply penetrated the cultural consciousness of many countries, evolving from propaganda reports to complex artistic interpretations. As early as June 1940, the British Ministry of Information released a series of documentaries that presented the evacuation as a triumph of national spirit. The short film For Freedom, with narration by J.B. Priestley, became the first cinematic interpretation of the events. It deliberately avoided showing chaos and losses, focusing on the heroism of ordinary people and their small boats. German propaganda responded with its own films, portraying Dunkirk as a crushing defeat and a panicked retreat of the enemy. The weekly newsreels Die Deutsche Wochenschau showed mountains of abandoned weapons and crippled equipment as proof of a complete rout. French newsreels of the Vichy period presented the evacuation as a betrayal by the British ally. The first significant artistic interpretation was the British film In Which We Serve from 1942. Noel Coward and David Lean created a picture about a fictional destroyer that participated in the evacuation. The film was characterized by restraint and realism, avoiding both excessive pathos and the depiction of all the horrors of war. Literature also responded to the events off the French coast. Robert Henriquez, in his novel Proud Island, described Dunkirk through the eyes of a simple soldier. His hero sees not a heroic epic, but chaos, fear, and despair, mixed with moments of unexpected courage and camaraderie. This was one of the first texts to show the other side of the official narrative about Dunkirk. Post-war culture brought a more complex view of the events. The British film Dunkirk from 1958, directed by Leslie Norman, for the first time showed the operation from different perspectives, through the eyes of soldiers on the beach, civilian sailors, and military command in London. The film did not shy away from showing losses and chaos, but maintained the general theme of the Dunkirk spirit. In the 60s and 70s, with the growth of a critical attitude towards official history, works appeared that questioned established myths. John Harris's novel showed the evacuation through the eyes of a small boat owner, who sees not only heroism, but also cowardice, panic, and desertion. BBC television documentary Projects, for the first time, gave a voice to ordinary participants in the events, whose memories often did not coincide with the official version. French cinema long avoided the theme of Dunkirk as a painful reminder of defeat. Only in the 80s did films appear that touched upon the fate of French soldiers who remained to cover the evacuation. Bertrand Tavernier's drama The Last Days, showing Dunkirk through the eyes of a French officer who feels betrayed by his allies, particularly stood out. The beginning of the 21st century brought a new surge of interest. Dunkirk became not just a historical event, but a metaphor for resilience in the face of catastrophe. The British series The Dunkirk Spirit explored the impact of the evacuation on the subsequent lives of its participants. The documentary The Forgotten Heroes of Dunkirk for the first time detailed the fate of the French rearguard soldiers. The pinnacle of modern interpretation was Christopher Nolan's film Dunkirk from 2017. The director abandoned a traditional linear structure, showing events through 3 intertwined timelines. Minimalist dialogue, an emphasis on visual storytelling, and sound effects create an immersion into the chaos of the evacuation. Nolan avoids both heroization and excessive naturalism, creating a multi-layered work that reflects the complexity of historical memory about Dunkirk. 80 years have passed since the sands of Dunkirk witnessed one of the most dramatic pages of World War II. But the echo of those events still resonates in the modern world. Dunkirk is not just the name of a French city or a military operation. It is a metaphor that continues to shape our understanding of crises, leadership, and human resilience. The lessons of Dunkirk are surprisingly relevant in today's world of global crises. First and foremost, it is a lesson that even a catastrophic defeat can contain the seeds of future victory. When British and French forces found themselves pushed back to the sea, the situation seemed hopeless. However, it was at this moment that the qualities that determined the outcome of the entire war emerged: determination, inventiveness, and the unity of a nation in the face of danger. In the modern world, where global crises, from pandemics to climate change, demand collective solutions, the quote serves as a reminder that the unification of ordinary citizens can work miracles. The flotilla of small boats that saved the army became a symbol of how civil society can mobilize to solve seemingly insurmountable problems. Dunkirk also taught a bitter lesson about the danger of overconfidence and underestimating the enemy. Hitler's decision to stop the tanks, his confidence that the Luftwaffe would cope with the task of destroying the encircled troops. All this stemmed from an arrogance that later proved fatal for Nazi Germany. In an era when political leaders of different countries demonstrate similar overconfidence, this lesson is particularly relevant. For military strategists, Dunkirk remains a classic example of how tactical success can turn into strategic defeat. The Germans won the battle, captured enormous trophies and territories, but missed the main thing: the opportunity to deliver a decisive blow. In modern conflicts, where victory is often determined not by territorial conquest, but by achieving strategic goals, this lesson is particularly significant. In diplomacy and international relations, the memory of Dunkirk continues to influence interactions between countries. For Great Britain, the Dunkirk spirit has become part of its national identity, a symbol of the island nation's special role in European affairs. It is no coincidence that during the Brexit debates, proponents of leaving the European Union often appealed to this historical episode, emphasizing Britain's ability to act independently in critical moments.